Hello, everyone, and welcome again to the Philly Factor. I'm your host, Paul Perrello. For a generation of kids growing up in Philadelphia, we had our childhood television heroes. They included Gene London, Sally Starr, Pixan, Captain Noah, Happy the Clown, Bertie the Bunyip. I'm really dating myself here, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say Uncle Pete, which was the late actor Peter Boyle's father, who had a show on Philadelphia television. And included in the mix, perhaps many years after those local television icon names that I just mentioned, was Dr. Shock. Dr. Shock still conjures up memories of watching those B-rated horror films on Channel 17 in Philadelphia. And I was sort of surprised when I saw that there was a book that has been released, Shock, Let There Be Fright, which features Dr. Shock as a character in the book. The author of the book is Neil R. King. He's joining us here on this edition of the Philly Factor. Neil, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
I want to mention right from the get-go that this is not a book per se about the actor who played Dr. Shock, but Dr. Shock happens to be a character in your book, correct?
Correct. Yeah,
So,
go ahead.
what's your fascination with Dr. Shock and the actor who played Dr. Shock?
Well, just like yourself, I mean, I grew up in a little town, Stratford, New Jersey. So right outside of Philadelphia, we're very close. Right now, I live in Collingswood, New Jersey, right outside of Philly. And so growing up in the 70s, he was on. And so he went on from, I think it's 1970 to 79.
Mhm.
So I'm just like a lot of kids at that time. I was, pretty young guy, and they had an afternoon show. It was on Saturdays, that adult creature double feature, and he was on for for so many years of my youth, in the 70s. And I always, was very into the whole thing. And there were other ones on, there were other small, uh, like movie things that were going on, like of classic films. Because back then, uh, you would have we really only had seven channels
That's
around.
right.
So we had channel 19, 29, and 48 in this Philadelphia area.
Right.
So I was just like probably everyone else. Um, that's what we could watch. And so became a big fan of those movies. And like you were saying, there were a lot of B movies, but the ones that I loved were the Universal movies from the 30s and the 40s. So imagine, um, just growing up on all that stuff. And I really just, he was, it was amazing, the amount of time that he did it. I mean, they had him on every week, and he didn't have a lot of time on each one of them. In the book, I try to make sure that people kind of understand that, like in a whole piece, that he might be on for like 6 minutes, like in a to host. So
Sure.
they would trim down those movies just a little bit, like a minute here, a minute there. And I didn't even realize that they would have, what if I saw those movies now, I'd be like, oh, there's an extra scene or two in there that I didn't actually see. But so yeah, so he would host it, and he was a character, and it was a really low budget stuff, just like all those things were back then. And I just loved it. And then in 79, it went away. And he had had a heart attack. He died.
Hmm.
And back then, they didn't have like a whole backlog of just to go back to do all that stuff. They filmed on VHS tape. They would tape on top of it. So the only things you can possibly see of it now is if you go onto YouTube, and they do have a few, like people have some of the things. And I don't know if you know the Rick Fox. He was one of the guys who actually uh, would be there for the camera, and he helped him with some of the bits and all that stuff. And I was actually able to talk to him about a year or two ago, and try to ask him a few things about the stuff. So anyway, to get to it, I really did love the character, and you never saw what he looked like. So it always interested me what a guy like that was like. And then I looked into his life, and that year, 1979, when he died, the big thing about it was he probably did know he was going to die. His father had died at like I think his father died at 41 or 42, and that's how old he was. He was 41 or 42. Already had a lot of heart problems, and he died that year. So to me, the idea of the book is you have this character who plays a ghoul, like somebody who is as a dead man. He comes out of his coffin for every show. It's a big bit, and he would just tell you about the movies. He'd do a few things, but playing a man who was already dead and that knew that he was probably going to die that year really made me think about what kind of a story you could create from that premise.
You've created a wonderful story from that premise. The name of the book again is Shock, Let There Be Fright. And the time of his death, 1979, was also, I guess, a turning time in television too, because that's when we start to see the beginnings of what is, a conglomerate now of cable television. I grew up in South Philadelphia, and I was happened to be on the east side of Broad, where you couldn't get cable. But if you lived on the west side of Broad, you could get some cable channels. But 19,
Exactly.
yeah, 1979 was really when cable started to come into our living rooms. And it's almost sad to say that, and some of those other names that I rattled off at the beginning of the show here, like Sally Star and Pixan and Happy the Clown, they all had faded away quickly because television was changing. We've got to remember that when these personalities were on TV, it was still the early days of TV, and you sort of rattled off what UHF stations we had, and as well as the VHF stations that we had, 3, 6, and 10. But television was really changing, and cable was coming in. And it's sad to say that somebody like Dr. Shock, unfortunately, he died at the age of 42, but with the advent of cable, he probably would have been canceled or faded away at that point anyway.
Yeah, without a doubt. I think that's what a big thing is, that cable box would really change that, the seven stations going to right away. I think we had 30 or something. It was, however many it went up to. And that's a big difference. And that those stations that were just hanging on, watching, having all these reruns, and there was a lot of, I mean, I think it really gave me, as I was born in 1964. So I'm the last year of the baby boom.
Sure.
And I feel like for me and people who are around my age, I feel like we're that bridge of I really watched all of that stuff on television from the 30s. And but then I was watching the newer things too, but I always have had, and still, because I watched it like that, have a great hunger to see that stuff still. And it just was it's classic, and it was a part of my vocabulary in my life. So, but that was a big thing. And because those TV hosts, that slowly was over. Even on television, the Sonny and Cher's, all the variety shows, that was kind of coming to an end also. And things were really going to change. But he worked for Channel 17.
Right.
So that Channel 17 also had the Phillies. And I bring this up kind of in the book quickly. There's a scene or two that because it's the Phillies and it's the summer, they would be on a Saturday, and he would not have his show on. They would, not, cancel it for that day, and they would just go over. And they knew that the reality, he had a nice following, a very nice following, but they really, they had Phillies baseball,
Yeah.
and that had to take precedence over him. And I think it's just amazing now. Like, you don't even see those kind of kid hosts anymore. Like, that really ended when he was gone. I think Captain Noah might have been left,
I think so.
like in this general area for people who live in the area. And he was really it. And when he died, I mean, it's crazy, but him not even being there on that Saturday, they probably didn't even have those things anymore. And then I just probably went right to cable and took off from our regular did I watch Channel 17 other than the Phillies?
Mhm.
Probably didn't.
The Given his contributions to the local television scene and his impact on you and so many other kids, um, I mean, what type of influence? I mean, if a question that I often get is, how did, what made you decide to get into this business, or when did you know this is what you wanted to do? I mean, given the fact that you have so well stated that, the impact that, Dr. Shock had on you, I mean, given your work today, I mean, is there some type of influence that he had either directly or indirectly on you as to what you're doing today?
Yeah, and I think there's something also I was thinking that's interesting about that generation is that, they're kind of vaudevillians, they're that last stage of it where they would get up and they did their funny bit. He loved magic, he loved all those things. But if you think about a lot of the ways that even his little presentations were for the show, I mean, I actually was talking to this Rick Fox, and all they would have is like a big curtain that came down, and that was his backdrop, and they had a table in front, and that was something that you could do. You
Yeah.
could make your own little things. And I think that generation was very willing to do anything. Like that's what he wanted to do. He just wanted to be creative, and he was a creative guy. And to me, when I looked at that backdrop and just the little drawings that they would have, or their phony paintings about to try to make it look scary, and that he introduced us to this whole world of very creative people who had these interesting stories, and it was a whole time. I think, and not to say also a Captain Noah or Captain Kangaroo, or to me, like again, our generations might be slightly, we're close, but
Mhm.
like Gene London, when I was very young, Gene London was on, he would draw. And
Sure.
so, those are things that I think build something, and they were local. So you had a good shot of seeing them. They weren't a national people. Like you wouldn't see Captain Kangaroo, but you had a shot to see Captain Noah somewhere at some, carnival or some
Sure.
kind of thing. And these guys had to make a living also outside. He didn't make any money as making this creature double feature. He had to go out and do parties and, do all kinds of different things to make a living. And I think that is definitely something in my DNA to say, oh, I'm a creative person. I like to do something. I'll work hard at that. And
Mhm.
I'll try to be somebody who that that could just make it. You never know.
Sure.
But you could just do it on your own. And I do like that thing about him.
When uh, when you decide to write this book, and as I said at the beginning, it is not a biography of Dr. Shock and the actor who portrayed Dr. Shock. I mean, how do you walk that fine line between writing something that's biographical and something that is um, people are going to pick up and they're going to enjoy, and whether they've heard of Dr. Shock or not, or they maybe somebody like our generation that would say, "Oh yeah, I remember watching Dr. Shock on Channel." I mean, how do you walk that fine line between doing a biography and then doing something that's like a work of fiction?
Yeah, I think that from the beginning, I had to realize that there's not a lot of information about him. He still has children who are alive. I didn't want to do anything that would be something that would be in any way taken like, oh, we didn't understand what that is, or that, just talking to, again, I bring up Rick Fox again, and he
Yeah,
had spoken to he was friends with Dr. Chuck's widow. And he had told his wife that he didn't want anything done, a movie done about him and all those things. So Rick wouldn't give me any information on the stories that he has, lots of stories about some of the things they did. But he would say, "Hey, we did these fun things and all those things." And to me, I think the interesting thing is, and now having done lots of stories about lots of different things, that I think shock became to me this feeling of what the 70s were. And that's what I think the book is about. And that he is all of us in the 70s, and his different things. But I did want to show, just saying, hey, he had to go to do these kid shows. He had to talk to all kinds of press all the time. He was moving around all the time. He was worried about ratings. He was worried about all the different things that you do. So I think, and because he's so much of a part, like there's nothing about him that I don't think about, watching Frankenstein, like from 1931. And I don't think about, watching the Creature from the Black Lagoon. I still see him there. So when I thought the best idea of it would be is to have him a part of that. So his dreams and his feelings about at some type of whenever he's having a problem or thing, you could switch right into if someone wants to see what he looks like as without his makeup, that he thinks of a scene of the Invisible Man when the Invisible Man takes off all the stuff. Like to me, that's the way that I think of him. So that's where I kind of went in that direction.
So besides talking to Rick Fox, um, did you talk to anybody else that would have known him, or does that sort of?
No, you know what? I looked up. There was a book or two that had some images of him, and they did a nice job. I put it into my book to uh, to be able to get a little background because all there are the same pictures. There are just uh, a certain amount of pictures of him. There's not much video. There's not much stuff. But I'll tell you, after making the book and how many times I would tell people, they're like, well, what are you working on? I was like, well, this graphic novel, it's about Dr. Shock. Do you know Dr. Shock? And I can't tell you, every single place I've ever gone with a group of people, somebody was like, oh, he did a birthday party for me. Or he came to Stratford, where I grew up, and he was on one of those things. He had a hearse or something, and he would be on there, and you go down there. Everybody knew who he was, and he would go to different. He had a lot of events. Um, so that was a thing that after I started talking to people, because there aren't that many people around who really knew him. And again, to me, like the whole project is to really show the pressure that those guys had, the reality that used to be. I brought up Happy the Clown.
Sure.
If you remember Happy the Clown, like I don't even remember Happy the Clown, but there are images of him still you can see on that. And he was huge,
Mhm.
like huge. And he had a lot of sponsorship and all that stuff. And that's what those guys looked at. There are a lot of those kinds of things. So there are possibilities. What would we have without those guys? I mean, the Jim Hensons in the world, like they all came from watching these people do programming for kids and all that kind of stuff. But back then, they could get a lot of advertising, local advertising, and they would go right on television and show a soap thing like, oh, look at this. And they could compete with any of the national shows. But then
Sure.
I believe I wrote in the book, like they got FCC or something, got rid of that. You can't do ads like that anymore, and it wiped them all out.
Yeah.
You can't compare to what the bigger national things are. So all those local guys, those, who could do those kinds of shows, puppet shows, because there were more of them. Um, Adam Android, like there are lots of little ones that I can still remember in the 70s, but they were all gone pretty quickly.
Does that give you, as an author, then more creative liberty to explore areas about the character if there's really nothing there documented per se? I mean, if you didn't talk to his daughter who was featured on his shows,
Right.
his the character
Oh,
of
right.
Bubbles, right? I mean, so does that give you, as the author, then a little more creative liberty to go into areas or explore other areas?
Right.
Um,
I think without it, I think if I tried to make, I mean, he's a really nice man and he was a family man and all those things. And just like anything, I'm probably like you. I'll read some autobiography or something or watch a great film about someone. And most of the time, they're just regular people
yeah,
and they try to dramatize their lives. But here's a man who worked very hard and he was making a living and he was just like anybody else. He sold shoes like before, like he was worked at a deli, he did all that kind of stuff. So to me, I took all of those little bits that he was involved in. He did work at a deli, apparently. He did
yeah,
work at all those kind of things, and I made it a part of it. But then to me, I brought in what I think the 70s were about, and but the whole idea about that kind of creative feeling of somebody who's always thinking about jokes or always thinking about magic. And so I hope that when people read it, that they're looking for some of those things. Because I mean, I have Sally Starr in it and she's on a motorcycle, like she saves him from zombies. So, like I think it's a crazy scene, but it's really just him and he's worried about dying and she's saving him and just talking to him because she loves him and he was a friend. And I don't even know if they're friends.
Yeah.
But to me, seeing Sally Starr and very little growing up, but she seemed like one of those characters that would be great to remind people of that she did stand for that kind of stuff for people. And maybe not as somebody on motorcycles saving the guy from that, but I did like the idea of thinking that we were with him at the end. Like he went in the book again, he goes to Walt Whitman, and he goes to Whitman Tomb right over in Jersey,
Mhm.
and just wants to talk to somebody about, you know, not being around anymore. And I guess that's what the whole thing is.
Yeah. I mean, you talked about some of the other television hosts of our day. I mean, has this experience led you to maybe want to write about some of the other ones, or is this sort of like, okay, one and done with Dr. Shock, I'm going to move on to something totally different? I mean, because they all had stories, and in my previous life as a radio person, um, I met Sally Starr. I met Howard Jones, who was Happy the Clown. I mean, I
Right.
met Gene London and interviewed all of them. So, I mean, they did have their own, stories to tell. And unfortunately, they sort of just have faded away. And Neil, I'm not telling you anything here, but if you were to take an average, high school kid or a college kid and say, Dr. Shock, they would say Doctor Who. I don't know if he takes my copay or not. I mean, they have no perspective as to who these icons in local television were.
Yeah, I think that that is the thing, and it is our memory. And, again, I say, last year, the boomers, we all hold on to these things. And to show my own daughter some of the old movies that I loved and all the things, and understand that in many ways, they just can't understand why I love them so much,
Sure.
or because it's just a part of you. And I would love to see things about each one of them or the industry a little bit more. But I think for most of the things that the books I do, especially like I'm working on lots of things, but I do try to think about setting them in those 70s or 80s and all this stuff, or to get an idea of what it was like to be around at that time, and the smallness of the world. And I was bringing up in the thing, like, we all watched the same television. Like
Sure.
there wasn't everyone watched All in the Family, or
Yeah.
everyone watched Mary Tyler Moore, or all the different things. And you couldn't go around anywhere, where now, just I'm sure you feel it too. Like when you talk to somebody about what are you watching, they could be watching so many things that you would never be able to get close to. Nobody, sometimes they get big, but most of the time there's so much variety that we all are a little bit distant in the things that we like, probably I'm sure as Americans too, that we don't have that. Oh, the Jeffersons and all, and I know exactly what that is, and everyone knew what it was. There was only one of three options that you had to watch that night. So, but I think that for myself, he's was important to me because, again, as an illustrator, as a storyteller, like I think he just was just this thing, this personification of, you could do your own little movies, and he's a lover of, whether he was or not either too, of lovers of the movie, that if you're a creative person, you can find an outlet to show the things that you do.
We should mention that your book is available on Amazon. And you can also get more information about the book as well as Neil at neil r king illustration.com. That is his website. And whether you are a child of the 60s or 70s, or you're just looking for a good read, I think, Neil, this is something that anybody could really pick up and get fully immersed in the story of Dr. Shock. I mean, you don't necessarily need to know all the players like Dr. Shock and Sally Starr and everybody else that we brought up, because you could really immerse yourself in a story that perhaps you never heard of these people before, and you might find yourself wanting to know more about these people.
Yeah. I hope that that's how it reads. And I think that with comics, the things about them is like I like the fact that in the backgrounds I'll have music that was playing, and then you could look that music up and you could listen to it perhaps while you're reading, or it's in the background, or while you're like, well, what is he talking about
Sure.
with that? And I think that sets uh, the scene into a feeling that you know, uh, that I think most people would enjoy with. And again, I don't, it's a graphic novel, so it's not something that everybody reads. And that's the other thing about graphic novels. It's like it's a little movie, and but an illustrated movie. And I think that it'll, especially like you're saying, I think most people could be really into it. But I do believe that, to me, you're talking about somebody who's in their 30s or something, and they're up, and then they would be like, yeah, actually, I know that. Like, I know what he's doing, or this is, or whether they realize it's a scene from, like Sally Starr's riding in the back, and that's where I try to have like little locales, like
Sure.
Rocky ran down in the, around the waterfront, but in the background, Godzilla is there. Like it's the craziness of it is the layering, hopefully, of it that people will enjoy.
Well, congratulations on the book, Neil. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing what's next with you. Shock, Let There Be Fright by Neil King is available on Amazon. I want to thank you, Neil, for being with us here on this edition of the Philly Factor. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Until next time, ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much for being with us on this edition of the Philly Factor. My name is Paul Perrello. We'll catch you next time around.